Lovely to see so many people here today. Just in case you're in any doubt, this is the workshop that's focused on the future of artificial intelligence, language, ethics, technology. So if you think that you're in the wrong place and this isn't what you're expecting today, the exits are at the back and at the front here, so do make use of them. Hopefully you've all picked up a booklet for today, so you've got the schedule, so you'll know what's happening and who's speaking when. So I'm not going to go through that in detail because I think you've already got that. I'm just going to say a few things just really to provide some context for this workshop and hopefully just raise a few topics and issues that will be developed in greater detail by the other speakers who are here today. Some of you may have noticed that one of the people who was advertised on the poster, Professor van den Hoven, was unable to join us today. He had to pull out at the last minute for personal reasons. So I, either wisely or foolishly, offered to give a talk to fill that slot. So that's why there might be a slight change based on perhaps the poster that you saw, but that's the only change. So this workshop is really the inaugural event for a 4-year project that's based here in Cambridge and specifically here in CRASSH. The title of the project is Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, and the subtitle of it, as you can see, is The Social Impact of Artificially Intelligent Communications Technology. You can see the people who are most closely involved in this project. Ian Roberts from Modern and Medieval Languages here in Cambridge. He can't be here today, unfortunately, but he's one of the people who's involved in sort of organising the things that are taking place as part of this project. Anne Copestake's involved, who's sitting at the back there. Bill Byrne is also around. I've seen him earlier. I can't see him now, but I know he's in the room. I'm Marcus Tomlin. I'll talk a little bit later. As I say, I'll give one of the talks today, so I'll say a little bit more about who I am and how I fit into this at that point. Then we've got Stephanie Ullman, who's at the front here, who's one of the research associates on the project, and we've just appointed another research associate who hasn't officially started yet, but will be starting, I think, in June. And I should say that this project is funded by the International Foundation for the Humanities and Social Change. And as you can see, there are 4 centres associated with that foundation, and the Cambridge-based centre is one of them. And we're fortunate today that we've got Nina Rismal. I don't know if you just want to put your hand up. Nina sitting here, who's a representative from the foundation. So if you have any questions about the foundation and its work and why it exists and what it seeks to do, then maybe at some point having a chat with Nina would be a good thing. And at the bottom of this one, if you can see, I know it's a bit gloomy, I'm just giving a little kind of trigger warning because at least one of the examples that I look at today it contains a little bit of language that's a bit problematical, but that's one of the topics that we're addressing today, so it's hard to avoid. So let me just say a little bit more about why this particular project and this particular workshop, why they have the focus that they do. There's obviously a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence. I mean, over the past 5 or 10 years, this has yet again emerged as a topic that is of considerable interest. And I guess those of us who are involved in developing AI systems, so the people who write the software and design the systems, sometimes get a little bit frustrated by this emphasis on artificial intelligence. It often gives the impression that AI is some sort of homogeneous thing and that basically any AI system is very much like any other AI system. In practice, that's not the case. AI is really an umbrella term that covers a wide range of quite heterogeneous systems. And I know this is a bit faint here, but this is just a tiny part of the whole kind of AI ecosystem. You've got things like speech technology, natural language processing, expert systems, robotics, deep learning, computer vision. They all interconnect in a wide range of complicated ways. And specific mathematical models and algorithms and methods that work extremely well for certain AI tasks don't work particularly well for others. So again, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity here. And to try and avoid the problem, I guess, of discussing AI in its totality, the focus that this project takes and the focus of this workshop is specifically on artificially intelligent communications technology. So basically, it's on AI systems that have some sort of language-based element, because that enables us to reduce things so that we've got a more manageable subset. So, as I say, that's really what this little acronym AICT stands for. So it's a sort of combination of artificial intelligence and information and communications technology. So these are basically AI systems that use techniques from speech technology, so things like speech recognition, speech synthesis, machine translation, things like that, and also techniques from natural language processing. So that could be natural language generation, document summarization, those sorts of things. And I suppose the prototypical examples in the modern world of these kind of systems would be these, increasingly well-known virtual personal assistants, things like Siri and Alexa and Cortana. These are things that we interact with using our voices. They have access to various pieces of information, and they communicate that information to us either in written form or in spoken form. So it's a dialogue-based interaction with these AI systems. And in particular, we're interested in the ethics of these systems. And obviously, this is a topic that's receiving particular attention at the moment. The government set up the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation last year, and the role of that centre is gradually becoming clearer as it becomes established. The House of Lords Select Committee on AI published its report AI in the UK last year, and we'll hear a little bit more, I think, about that in just a few minutes' time. If you haven't read it, it's well worth reading. One of the things that struck us, and by us I mean those of us involved in setting up this project, was the emphasis on ethical AI systems. The report, I think, quite appropriately, was sceptical to some extent of the way in which the UK can try to compete with, say, America and China in terms of developing AI systems. There are economic reasons why that's going to be tremendously difficult. But the report concluded that, and you can see it there, quoting it, the UK has a unique opportunity to forge a distinctive role for itself as a pioneer in ethical AI. And in essence, we agree with that. But if we're thinking about ethics in the context of artificial intelligence and these kinds of systems, there are certain topics that usually receive a great deal of attention, often for very good reasons. So things to do with data and data protection, obviously since the introduction of GDPR last year, that's something that has a particular focus. And things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I think, is still there as a sort of classic example of some of the problems that can result when data is handled perhaps in ways that might be deemed unethical. Going along with that, there's a frequent emphasis on things like transparency, explainability, and accountability. There's a concern that many of these AI systems are effectively black boxes. They do things, but we don't necessarily understand how and why they do them. And therefore, there's a desire to have these systems be able to justify and explain the decisions that they made. And this leads to an interest in things like data provenance, where is the data gone, but also decision provenance. What's the sort of route by which the decisions are being made? And in discussions of these AI systems, it's often the case that it's the ones that involve life and death situations that frequently hit the headlines. So things to do with AI-assisted medical diagnosis or self-driving cars. And then, of course, the killer robots. Everyone's terrified of killer robots. That's often what it's all about. And all of these things are legitimate to some extent. And I suppose those of us involved with this project would say that in addition to all of these things, there are plenty of other ethical considerations that perhaps don't receive the attention they deserve. as soon as you think about ethics in the context of language-based systems, you enter a slightly different realm. There's been a lot of work recently on how the languages that people use have an impact on the ethical judgments that they make. And to be more specific than that, the ethical judgments that people make often vary depending upon whether they're using their first language or their second language. So language and ethics are very closely interconnected. You can also see that in relation to the various legal systems around the world that prohibit certain types of language use. Most recently, this is expressed in the form of anti-hate speech legislation. And so these legislative bodies that introduce laws that make it a criminal offence to use certain types of language in certain types of ways. And then I guess on a smaller level, things like broadcasters, the BBC or whatever, usually have quite tight regulations about what people can and can't say when they're being broadcast on, TV or the radio. And, you've all seen examples where they've had a guest on who's stepped over the line of appropriateness, and then the presenters have to apologise, usually multiple times, to try and calm down the viewers so that they're not too angry about that. So in terms of regulating human linguistic behaviour, there are whole sets of infrastructures that regulate that to some extent. But at the moment, none of these things are required to apply to any of these artificially intelligent communications technologies. Here's just one example of how this can be problematical. Some of you may know about this. It's from a couple of years ago now. So Microsoft released its Twitter chatbot, Tay. It was designed to learn interactively, so it learnt from the people who interacted with it. And it was sort of aimed at 18 to 24-year-olds in the US. I mean, already you might think, what could possibly go wrong with this? Within just a few minutes of it going live, it was just bombarded with hate speech from online trolls who thought it would be amusing to try and teach this system how to speak in certain ways. It had to be shut down 16 hours after its launch because it had already become sort of a racist, fascist chatbot, really. And then subsequently the CEO of Microsoft reflected upon this and said, the company really does need to take responsibility for this. I've given you two of the tweets there. When these originally appeared, this stuff wasn't crossed out. This is why I gave you the little trigger warning. I'm not going to read it out, but you can get the gist of this. And you've got the time at the bottom here. So this is just 11 minutes past 9 in the evening on the day that it was released. And then a few hours later, it's getting a little bit more subtle in its racism. But it's, still producing output that's, let's say, of dubious ethical merit. So if those are the sorts of problems that we encounter with these language-based systems, how could these technologies be designed so that they, I suppose, protect their users from some of these things? And of course, these sorts of questions are difficult ones because they bring into combination perhaps a natural tendency towards a libertarian approach that says basically people should be free to say whatever they want to say. But then there's also a concern to protect people from language that they perhaps don't want to encounter. So here's just one example. So there's an American skier, Gus Kenworthy, who came out as being gay a few years ago. And it's become a sort of routine thing that his YouTube channel is just bombarded with homophobic rants, really, from usually anonymous users. So, again, I'm not going to read this out, but if it's clear enough, you can see this is basically a sort of homophobic rant that just appears on his YouTube feed. And if these technologies were set up in a slightly different way, you could implement techniques such as quarantining. So in other words, using automated techniques, you might be able to pick up on some of the problematical vocabulary in that post, so that before it appears on his feed and he just has to encounter it, it might trigger an alert like this. So with a sort of rating in terms of this is a sort of hateometer, the degree homophobic hate that seems to be expressed there. And then he, as a user of YouTube, has some sort of choice. You know, he can curate this a little bit, and he might decide, yes, I'm going to read this and allow it to appear, or he might decide, you know, I'll read it, but will decide whether I allow it to appear. And that kind of quarantining can act as a buffer zone, so that people just don't have to encounter content that's you know, offensive in various ways. So these are some of the sorts of techniques that you know, we're interested in thinking through from a technical implementational level, but also from a broader philosophical perspective. Is quarantining inherently bad because it contravenes free speech? Well, I think there are interesting conversations that can take place about that. So, broadly in relation to the project, we feel that these topics can be addressed in numerous ways. I mean, obviously there's the usual sort of academic outputs, conference papers, journal articles, that sort of stuff. But I think it's also important to raise public awareness about these issues. So this little picture here, this is Bill Byrne in the middle and me on the left at the Hay on Wye festival last year, where we were talking about some of these things in relation to machine translation. And I think things like that are very helpful. You know, users of these technologies, and I think for me that's the difference between things like killer robots and something like Siri and Cortana. I don't know very many people who own killer robots. I know lots of people who use Siri, Cortana, and Alexa. So these technologies are in their pockets, are having an impact on their lives, on the lives of their children as we speak. And so people have views on these technologies and how they should be structured, how they should be designed. And so I think connecting with the users of these technologies is essential. But I think also involving government is important. And you know, in the first talk this morning, we'll hear perhaps a little bit more about ways in which the government can have an impact on influencing the way these sorts of technologies are designed and developed within universities, but also obviously within various corporations. And then there's the issue of education. You know, currently students who come to Cambridge, if they study medical sciences, they have to study medical ethics. It's obligatory. But they can come here and study information engineering and computer science, and they don't have to study any ethics modules at all. Maybe that's something we need to think about. If they're going to become people who develop systems that have some sort of ethical impact on the world at large, maybe they need to think about that while they're learning those techniques and learning those skills. So that's, again, something that we're keen to focus on over the next 4 years. So this workshop, as I say, is really just the beginning of what will be a sort of long-term conversation interaction. These are just some of the ways in which, hopefully, today will be of some use. It'll give us an opportunity to reflect upon these sorts of things, and we hope that it's an enjoyable event. If it is, then you might be interested in the next event, the next workshop that we're organising. So again, the focus for this one is still on language and technology. That's pretty much always going to be the main focus. But the explicit emphasis of the second workshop will be on gender and all aspects of gender in the context of these types of language-based, artificially intelligent systems. So as some of you know, the Eventbrite page for this event was, you know, got quite a lot of interest, and this event was sort of oversubscribed. So if you think you might be interested in coming to that one, maybe registering an interest on Eventbrite sooner rather than later is good, so that you don't end up being waitlisted, because I know that's sometimes a fate worse than death.